Hi everyone, welcome back to the Tox Lab. I'm Rebecca.
I'm Rob. So this week we've got a special Christmas episode, which I'm really excited about. We're going to be looking at some Christmas poisonings. But before we jump into that, why did Rudolph have a red nose?
I don't know.
He had a dodgy boiler.
So bad.
Yeah, that was quite bad, that one.
Yeah. Shout out if you really enjoy the jokes on this podcast, or if you think we should cut them.
So anyway, we've made it to episode 8, which is really exciting.
Woo!
We're still smiling, which is really good.
Yeah, it's been fun. I hope everyone who's listening has enjoyed them as much as we've enjoyed making them.
Definitely. Yeah, so as I say, this week we're going to be looking at some festive poisonings. And I don't mean the actual Christmas poisons that we're probably all going to have a bit too much of. Alcohol and sugar.
I love a bit of sugar.
I like a bit of sugar too. But we're going to be looking at some of the things we associate with Christmas that may or may not be poisonous. So, Rebecca, poinsettia plant, bright red plant.
Yeah.
Poisonous?
I don't know, should we find out?
Let's find out. So, poinsettia plants, that red decorative plant that I didn't realise was a Christmas plant until I was much older than I'd like to admit, to be honest.
But they're so festive. How did you not?
Apparently. It just weren't something we had in our house. But they're reported to be, or at least believed to be, poisonous. Mm. You can go into Tesco and it says do not eat and things like that, which is probably good advice for lots of plants.
I think it's a standard rule, don't eat plants.
But, you know, there's an origin story here for this belief. So the poinsettia, first introduced to America by the American ambassador to Mexico, Mr. Ponset, believe it or not, hence the name. In 1920, there was an unconfirmed report of a 2-year-old Hawaiian child dying after ingesting a poinsettia leaf. In 1944, a book of poisonous plants of Hawaii by a Dr. Arnold took the story that was unconfirmed and described poinsettias, therefore, as highly toxic. Now, the author did later acknowledge that the story was unconfirmed and hearsay, but by that point, it had already been published. This was then magnified by the press. In the 80s, there were activists calling for warning labels. Poinsettias were banned from nursing homes and hospitals and places like that. The FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, actually contributed to the hysteria and claimed that one leaf could kill a child. And there were more and more books which were published showing that this plant was deadly poisonous. So we'd been digging in the archives and we found a study from 1996 that looked at poinsettia poisonings and reports to a poison control office. So Rebecca, why don't you take us through that?
So in this paper they looked at calls put to the American Association of Poison Control Centres between 1985 and 1992, and just looking at all reported plant cases. Poinsettia came up in 22,793 cases, 49% of which involved males, 93% involved children, and 70% of those were under the age of 2. So kind of sets the scene, it's like very likely to happen accidentally. They're bright red. They look quite pretty.
So it's children chewing the leaves, chewing the flowers, and people phoning the poison control people.
Yeah. And no surprise, 75% of these occurred between December and February. It's all very festive. 99% of these were accidental. Ingestion was the main route of exposure and occurred in 95% of all cases. And there were no fatalities reported. And quite interestingly, 92% were classed as having no effect. So not even any sort of symptoms related to the ingestion of poinsettia.
So in other words, lots and lots of calls to poison control, but actually very little poisoning.
Yeah.
Okay. So what was really interesting is that of the patients who did have some signs of symptoms, most of those were from dermal exposure, i.e. exposure to the skin, not by eating. So it actually looks like poinsettia is more poisonous to rub on your skin than it is to eat.
Interesting.
They do contain kind of a latexy sap, don't they? So that probably is a bit of an irritant to the skin. I suspect that's the reason why. So that's one poisonous plant off the bat, debunked, right?
Yeah.
Not that poisonous. Clearly, don't eat it and don't rub it on your hands. Keep your pets away and encourage your children not to eat it. But certainly not deadly in the way that it was once believed. Okay, so let's move on to another festive plant now that we'll all probably be familiar with. Holly. Iconic pointy dark green leaves, bright red berries.
Very festive.
Very festive. So holly, a traditional Christmas plant or winter plant. Originally it was believed it could bring protection and ward off evil spirits. And its relationship to Christmas, I'm told, is all about the Christian symbolism, sharp leaves representing Jesus' crown of thorns and red berries symbolising blood and that sort of thing. But big question, are they poisonous? I remember as a kid being told, don't touch the holly berries, they're poisonous. So I guess that might be true, although as we've learnt from the poinsettias, that may not always be the case. Are there any studies?
So when researching for this episode, it was really hard to try and find any cases like we had with the poinsettias that covered hollyberry poisonings. And I'm not sure there's that much data out there to suggest either way whether hollyberries are actually poisonous.
Interesting. I mean, they do contain some poisonous things,
They
right?
do.
So we know that holly contains methylxanthines, so caffeine and theobromine. Caffeine, amazing, found in coffee. Theobromine, also amazing, found in chocolate.
Love it.
So, at first glance, hollyberries would actually just be delicious. But they do also contain a few other things, don't they? They do contain saponins, and these are compounds that disrupt cell membranes.
Yeah.
It's likely that they will cause GI distress. And I think there have been a couple of individual case studies. So with holly, it's the berries that are toxic, although obviously the leaves being quite tough and pointy are probably not very edible either.
Yeah, I can't imagine they'd be fun to try and eat.
No. And there have been a handful of cases in which children have eaten berries. And it does sound like there was one case in which a pair of twins had ingested a handful of berries, and one vomited 40 times and became drowsy, and the other had 5 episodes of vomiting but no drowsiness. It does sound like that hollyberries will cause some GI distress, but I don't believe there's been any fatalities reported.
Not that I could find.
No. So probably hollyberries are poisonous, although perhaps not fatally so. I guess, like anything, it does depend on how much of anything you ingest. So one of my earliest memories, bizarrely, as a child, is watching a bird eat hollyberries, and my mum telling me that hollyberries were poisonous, and me not understanding how a bird could eat the hollyberries and be okay. But you know, clearly birds do eat the berries because that's how they pass the seeds around. So
Yeah.
shows the differences in metabolism between humans and birds.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think in conclusion, there's not a lot of data out there on holly. They do contain exciting methylxanthines that we all know and love, but they also contain saponins, which probably cause quite a lot of GI distress. So don't eat hollyberries.
That's sound advice.
Okay, so one other festive plant, mistletoe.
Everyone loves a bit of mistletoe.
Do you have mistletoe at home?
No, but it looks pretty and...
It does look pretty. Yeah, you get these nice... It's the berries in particular that look nice, don't they? These really nice looking white berries. The tradition of kissing under the mistletoe apparently comes from the Norse tradition, where mistletoe was a symbol of love and peace.
Oh, nice.
And it became big in the Victorian times, again, based on that Norse tradition. I'm not quite sure why it's become a Christmas thing.
I don't know either.
No, I'm not really sure. If anybody does know, do let us know.
Yeah, maybe it's just when it flowers, or like when the berries appear, is like around Christmas time.
That probably is the case, isn't it?
Like with a lot of things.
Like with a lot of things. But the reason why we're here is mistletoe poisonous.
I mean, I've always had it is.
Yeah.
That's my assumption.
Again, that was another one that I was told growing up, don't eat the mistletoe berries. Not that I ever wanted to, but I definitely remember being told about mistletoe, fairly young age, to not eat it.
Were you the sort of child that would just go for nature?
I was actually, yeah. No, I wasn't a child that would eat lots of things, like beyond food, but I was the sort of child that would just pick plants, and I'm pretty sure I picked a poisonous mushroom when I was younger. It's fine, I didn't eat it. It's okay.
Fine. You're still here, it's okay.
It was one of those like classic fairy toadstools.
With like the red and the white dots.
Yeah.
They're pretty.
But yeah, mistletoe. Is it poisonous? Well, as you say, I've always been told it was. And we managed to find actually a study looking at mistletoe toxicity.
We did.
Which we thought we'd maybe share.
But it's a couple of retrospective studies.
Okay. Why don't you take us through one or two?
So the next paper we're going to look at on mistletoe was written by the same people who wrote about the poinsettia exposures. So again, they looked at calls to the American Association of Poison Control Centers between 1985 and 1992 and looked at the outcomes that were recorded. So out of 734,786 plant exposures, mistletoe accounted for 1,754 of those. Again, 92% of those were exposures to paediatric patients, so children. And ingestion was, again, the main route of exposure and happened in 96% of cases.
So once again, children eating berries and therefore, I assume berries actually, I guess it could be the leaves.
It could be.
In the case of mistletoe. And people then phoning poison control to report a potential exposure.
Yeah, exactly. So on the whole, most of these were accidental exposures, but there were 72 intentional exposures. 61% of those were classed as like abuse or misuse. 11% were for suicidal purposes. But there, again, were no fatalities reported in this data set from mistletoe. And on the whole, most patients were asymptomatic. The majority received no treatment at all. About 1,000 of them received what they classed as GI decontamination.
So that's what, activated charcoal, probably.
Yeah, and I think forced vomiting through ipecac.
Nasty.
And things like that. Some of these patients were symptomatic, but the majority of them were deemed to have minor symptoms. These weren't listed in this particular paper. But overall, I think the conclusion from this data set was that, again, mistletoe isn't actually that poisonous.
Possibly cause a bit of GI distress and things like that, but probably, on the whole, for accidental exposures, not going to do any serious long-term harm. Okay, why don't we look at the other study looking at mistletoe? Because there was a couple of papers, wasn't there? Yeah.
So the next paper we're going to look at looked at 11 patients aged between 6 months and 18 years who had ingested between 1 and 3 mistletoe berries. And there were 3 patients who were over the age of 3 who'd ingested a couple of leaves. And again, none of them became symptomatic. Most of them were observed at home without any intervention. The only intervention some of them received was, again, forced vomiting through ipecac, but it didn't seem to affect their outcome either. But what I did think was quite interesting is that there have been 2 previously reported deaths from mistletoe.
So, outside of these studies, there were a couple of cases that could be found in the literature.
Yeah, and I believe it was both of them involved tea that had been brewed with mistletoe.
So it's like sort of a cure-all or a tincture or something like that?
In this paper, they mentioned that one of those had made a tea that was intended for use as a tonic. The other one had used it, I think, to trigger an abortion. But yeah, some previously reported symptoms from mistletoe ingestion can include hypertension, hypotension, seizures, vomiting. Death has been reported in very few cases, but it's quite hard to determine because we don't have the data to look at whether these symptoms were truly caused by mistletoe poisonings or whether it was just that individual's general health, because they could have had a seizure disorder, for example, that could be kind of dirtying the data. But it's one thing we're probably never going to be able to unpick.
So there have been some studies done looking at compounds found in mistletoe, and there are a few things that probably are toxic in large enough doses. It does contain flora toxins, which are a type of lectin. And these are polypeptides that can affect cardiovascular function. So they can effectively cause alterations to heart rate and vasoconstriction. They also, interestingly, contain ribosome inactivating proteins. And these act in a similar way to the poison ricin, which you might have heard of.
Okay.
And it can cause quite a lot of cellular death because it effectively stops cells being able to produce proteins, and so cells then die. So in theory, there are some fairly highly poisonous compounds found in mistletoe, but perhaps this data suggests that they're not at levels significant enough to cause harm in sort of minor exposures.
Well, that's the thing with any of these. It depends on how much you're taking.
As always, the dose makes the poison,
Exactly.
Right?
So in these, it seems to be a handful of berries or a couple of leaves that have been ingested, but there isn't really any data on large quantities of berries or leaves being ingested and the sorts of effects that occur. And it's important to note with this, we're talking about American mistletoe,
Yes,
aren't we?
I was about to jump in on that. You're absolutely right. These studies were done in America, looking at American mistletoe. European mistletoe, which is what we get naturally growing in the UK, is actually reported to be a bit more toxic. It's got higher concentrations of these poisonous compounds. So I couldn't find a study in the UK or Europe looking at European mistletoe, but actually it could well be that although this study suggested American mistletoe was relatively non-harmful, possibly European mistletoe might be quite a bit more so. The other thing I wanted to mention about mistletoe, actually, fun fact, mistletoe is actually a parasitic plant. So it grows on other plants. And it can also contain toxins related to the host plant. So if it is growing on a poisonous plant, it can sometimes actually alter its toxicity profile.
That is really cool.
So it is possible that there was an incredible study recently I've read that looked at all of the compounds they had isolated from different mistletoe species growing on different host plants. And there was quite a variety of different compounds. So actually its toxicity profile might depend a bit on what plant it has grown on too. Okay, so mistletoe, probably poisonous, possibly significantly so. So definitely don't eat that one.
Yeah.
And as always, keep your pets and your children away from mistletoe.
Sound advice.
Okay, final thing I wanted to look at this week.
Switching gears a little bit.
And this might be controversial. Is nutmeg a Christmas spice?
Yes, 100%.
Okay.
It goes in gingerbread. Gingerbread is festive. Therefore, it's a Christmas spice.
Therefore, it's a Christmas spice. Great, that means we can talk about it.
Excellent.
So let's look at nutmeg. Nutmeg, interesting fact, used to be more valuable than gold, gram for gram.
Ooh.
Which is exciting. But is nutmeg poisonous?
I don't know.
Yes, you do. You've got the notes.
I do have notes.
So, nutmeg, more poisonous than I think many people realise.
I think so too, because before we were doing this episode, I hadn't really considered nutmeg to be something that was dangerous or poisonous. So the next paper we want to look at was a 10-year retrospective review on nutmeg poisonings that have been reported to an Illinois poison centre between January 2001 and December 2011. Again, they used the American Association of Poison Control Centres generic code for hallucinogenic plants and then narrowed it down by searching for nutmeg or its Latin name, which I'm not going to try and pronounce.
Myristica fragrans.
Yeah.
Possibly. My wife is probably
screaming at
me right now.
So they sorted this data, looking at age, gender, route of exposure, things like that. And then a medical professional classified the outcome from either no effect all the way through to death, and also had a category for those that they were unable to follow up. So all in all, through these 10 years, there was only 32 cases reported with a mean age of 13.
So let me just jump in there. Unlike poinsettia and mistletoe.
Yeah.
There were many, many cases of both of those.
Mm-hmm.
There was only a handful
Yeah.
of nutmeg cases reported to the Poison Control Centre.
68% of them were male. Interestingly, 47% of them were intentional exposures to nutmeg.
So 53% of them were accidental nutmeg exposures.
But it's still quite a high, compared to the other poisonings we've talked about in this episode, there were a lot more intentional exposures. Again, it is a really small data set, so it's not quite as easy to draw the same conclusions. And so similar to the other poisonings we've talked about today, the majority of them didn't require any further treatment, but 10 of them were admitted to hospital. But most of them had fairly minor effects. I don't think any deaths were reported in this data set. And the sort of symptoms that they looked at, they kind of break it down into categories. So you've got some cardiovascular effects, which included hypertension and tachycardia, the standard sort of GI issues, so nausea, vomiting. You've got some people who experienced hallucinations, agitation, drowsiness, confusion. There was one person who experienced a seizure. There was one person who also experienced respiratory depression, and a couple of them reported things like blurred vision. So quite a wide range of symptoms for something that I didn't initially think was toxic.
As you say, we put nutmeg on our gingerbread all the time, right? So this possibly is a little bit of a surprise.
Yeah.
But even more surprising is there has been a death reported.
There has.
And we have managed to find a case report. It was from 2001, so quite a few years ago, although nutmeg probably hasn't got less poisonous, so probably still relevant. Rebecca, why don't you take us through this little case study?
So this case centres around a 55-year-old female who had died. They went for an autopsy, had toxicology taken, and all they could find on toxicology was a flunitrazepam that was at a toxic but not fatal level, and there was no other explanation for why this woman had died.
Flunitrazepam, benzodiazepine, typically not fatal on its own, in general terms. It's not to say it can't be, but in this case, thought not to be the cause of death.
And it was really interesting as to what led them to look at nutmeg as a potential poison. The only clue they had was that this woman's stomach contents smell like nutmeg, which I can't imagine how much nutmeg must have been ingested to get your stomach contents to smell like it and not smell like stomach contents.
Yeah, I mean, this is peak toxicology, always using your senses to look for clues. But you're absolutely right. I mean, people probably don't want to know this, but anyone who's had to smell stomach contents will know it smells pretty gross.
Yeah.
So there must have been a heck of a lot of nutmeg in there.
So because they've identified the smell, they then went looking for myristicin. I've probably completely butchered that name, so apologies. And they identified it and quantified it using HPLC and UV vis spectroscopy, and found it to be present at a level of 4 micrograms per mil, which they've then done some maths and kind of estimated the sort of dose that would have been given.
It doesn't sound that high.
No, it doesn't, but it works out to be between 560 and 840 milligrams per kilogram of myristicin.
So they did some sums. We should point out that you shouldn't do calculations like this in post-mortem samples for drugs we have way more knowledge of. So these maths probably should be taken with a massive pinch of salt.
Completely, yeah.
But the authors estimated it to be about 36 grams of myristicin.
Yeah.
Which must be absolutely
tons
of nutmeg.
Yeah.
So why don't we talk about what makes nutmeg toxic? We've mentioned myristicin, but what is myristicin? Well, myristicin is a compound found in this sort of volatile oil part of a nutmeg, and it's got a really interesting structure. Myristicin is very similar in structure to MDMA. It contains a methionine dioxy group. And what's interesting about myristicin is it's metabolized to produce a compound called MMDA, which is even more like MDMA. And it has these psychoactive effects, so it can both stimulate serotonin receptors, dopamine receptors, but it also acts as a monoamine oxidase inhibitor. So as a result, you kind of get this serotoninergic style effect. Also, the MAOI effect can lead to increases in levels of neurotransmitters. And so this is why it's sort of psychoactive and can lead to hallucinations.
Which is possibly why there were more intentional exposures in that 10-year retrospective that we looked at earlier.
It's certainly,
because people know that it might be hallucinogenic and psychoactive, that more people are willing to take more nutmeg than you would normally to try and see if they can elicit these effects.
Yeah, so it's one of those compounds that students or children or people trying to look for a psychoactive effect legally might well go for. I actually had a friend who did once take too much nutmeg, and he spent 36 hours in bed regretting his life decisions.
Oh no.
It was, he would describe it as definitely do not do this. It was not a good sort of psychoactive experience by any means. He just spent the whole time feeling anxious and nauseous and couldn't really get up out of bed. Yeah, so in summary, nutmeg can be quite poisonous. Just to put it into perspective, you need at least sort of 1 to 3 teaspoons of nutmeg, which is what, 2 or 3 whole ground nuts of nutmeg. So,
Which I can't imagine is pleasant to try and eat.
No. So you do need quite a lot of it. So, it is definitely in smaller doses very good to put in your cookies and in your gingerbread and on your Christmas cocktails.
Ooh.
That sounds good, doesn't it?
That does sound really good.
But yeah, don't overdo the nutmeg, or you may well end up regretting it. So what have we learned?
Well, I feel like we've debunked a lot of myths on many festive plants that were believed to be highly poisonous.
And at the same time, possibly identified an innocent spice that we've possibly all been eating may actually have a much more sinister side. I think in summary, don't eat poinsettia or holly
or mistletoe,
and don't overdo the nutmeg. So I think we're going to wrap it up here. I hope you've all enjoyed listening. We're going to take a little break for Christmas for a couple of weeks, and we're going to be back on the 6th of January. So I hope you all have a great Christmas, and do give us a like or a follow.
So you can find us on Instagram at _tox_lab. So feel free to comment on any of our posts about any of our episodes with any sort of feedback or suggestions. You can now comment on Spotify as well, so we'd love to hear from you over on there too. But yeah, I hope you all have a wonderful festive season, and we will see you in 2025. Bye!